All right, well, good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, so we'll get going for the evening. Welcome to week number two for PPA 660 Organization Theory. For those of you who have participated in submitting Canvas essay number one, thank you for your submissions. All the posts that have been posted by about 4 or 4:30 today, I've had a chance to go through, and so far, so good. I think all the organizations that people are choosing really fit nicely with the class as well as with the organizational analysis paper. So there are certainly no problems there. If you have not had a chance to post yet, please make sure you do that by tonight, and I will then review it and give you some feedback on whether or not I think the organization will work. But again, pretty much any public or nonprofit organization is going to work relatively well. Large organizations, you're going to want to drill down those organizations, perhaps down to a unit, department, or division. On the other end of the spectrum, if it's a very, very small nonprofit organization, sometimes those can be a little problematic just because they don't have all the elements that we're looking for in the organizational analysis paper. But as I said, all the posts I've read so far, the organizations will all work very well. So this is week number two, and as you know, last week we just went over the course requirements basically. Tonight, what I'd like to do is in the first half of class, talk about some of these fundamental, foundational aspects of organization theory, kind of underscore how we study organizations and why we study organizations in the way in which we do, talk a bit about the differences between developing theories of organizations in the public versus the private sector, why private sector organization theories oftentimes don't work well for public and nonprofit organizations, and also why some public organization theories don't work well in every single organization as well. One of the things that we will see as we go through our chronological discussion of the evolution of organization theory is that the movement has certainly been from looking for a panacea, a one-size-fits-all approach, looking for that one perfect theory that can apply to every public organization. And instead, we've turned our focus to a more contingency-based contextual approach, looking for not the best theory, but rather the most appropriate theory to apply to that organization in a specific time period and within a specific set of characteristics. And so you will see that kind of develop as we go through our discussion. So that's for the first half of class tonight. Then we'll take our evening break. Then after our break, I will put you into our breakout rooms, and then we'll do a quick little breakout exercise, kind of looking at these differences between public and private organizations and identifying some differences that are salient for the problem we have in trying to apply private theories to public organizations. And all that being said, we will see once we start getting into our classic organization theories that we have borrowed very heavily from the private sector in applying private organization theories and with a varying amount of degrees of success. So in those breakout rooms, we'll talk about why we're limited in our ability to apply those private sector theories to public organizations to kind of, again, substantiate our rationale for why we do an organization theory course here in the MPA program, where we all know that they offer an organization theory class in the College of Business. And so we really want to provide you with some good rationale for why you're taking it here in the MPA program as opposed to taking it in the MBA program. Then once we're done with our breakout rooms, then we will reassess our time. And if we have enough time left, we may work ahead a little bit and start introducing classical organization theory and digging into Max Weber and the whole idea of rational organizations. But again, we'll kind of assess that after our breakout rooms and see if there is sufficient time remaining to then work ahead to classics. So that is our agenda for this evening. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into a discussion, very foundational level discussion of what is organization theory. Essentially, what are we here doing in this PPA 660 course? We all know what theories are. We know what models are. We know why we develop theories and why we develop models. We know that theories are developed in order to postulate some type of a relationship between abstract constructs. And so these concepts that are more difficult to measure, that don't have ready-made operational definitions, those are what we measure in our theories. So theories tend to postulate these relationships at a more abstract level. We then take these theories and we distill them down into research models. And research models are much more specific theories that postulate relationships between observable and measurable variables. So that's where we get into defining what the variables mean, coming up their operational indicators. So our methods really grow out of our theories. When we are talking about theory in this class, it kind of subsumes both this idea of theories and models, because as you'll see, some of our theorists are very specific in terms of the types of factors that are measured within organizations and how all those factors should be operationally defined. Other theorists work at a much more esoteric type of holistic level, where they're kind of look at the organization as a whole, and they're not really deconstructing their theories into these specific models. So it really depends upon the theorist and the school of thought that we are looking at. But for our purposes now, we're kind of going to use theories and models somewhat interchangeably. So we develop an organization theory. We are developing this theory about the organization in terms of how the organization is either structured or should be structured, the behaviors within the organization, how members of the organization relate with their organization, and how the organization relates with its external environment. And those are kind of the four main areas of focus that we'll see in our discussion of the development of organization theory. But let's look at each one of these different definitions of organization theory individually. And I'll kind of give you a little corollary between these different definitions of organization theory and kind of how the literature developed in other social sciences, specifically in a social science field such as political science. So, what is organization theory? Well, number one, it is a study of the structures of organizations. So, this is where we're looking at the organization chart. We are looking at the hierarchical structure within that organization. Is it a tall type of organization, a tall hierarchy? Is it a flatter, more egalitarian type of organization structure? So, we really look at the formal structure of the organization. Now, when you study the formal structure of the organization, you have some tangible artifacts that you can study. You have the organization chart. You have a list of all the different positions and the position descriptions for each one of those positions. So sometimes it's relatively easy to study the structure of an organization. What makes the study of structure of organization more difficult is that one organization may actually exhibit a multitude of different structures, in that there may be a tall hierarchy for the organization overall, but when you then drill down to individual departments, those individual departments may have a flatter type of a hierarchy as compared to the overall organization. So even with studying the structure of the organization, there are certainly a lot of nuances that we have to take into account. When we are studying the structure of the organization, implicit within a lot of these schools of thought, a lot of these theories, is a normative assumption. As you probably already know, that there are kind of these two different schools here. There's the normative school and the descriptive school. So the normative school asks the question, what ought this or what should this look like? So ask the question, what should the structure of the organization look like? In the descriptive question, we're asking, what does it look like? And so sometimes we ask descriptive questions to get to normative questions, but kind of the undercurrent of a lot of our organization theories is normative in nature. So we're asking the question, what should the structure of the organization look like? When we are studying structures, as you'll see in the next slide, we are dealing at the macro level of organization theory. And studying organizations as structures is very similar to the approach in political science from the 1940s and the 1950s, which was known as the institutionalist or traditionalist approach. So in political science, back in the 40s and 50s, if you were going to study Congress, you would study Congress as an organization. You would study the structure of Congress. You wouldn't pay a lot of attention to individual members and how individual members go about their daily business. You're instead looking at the structure. So you're going to look at the committees within Congress. You're going to look at the subcommittees within Congress, and you're looking at that formal type of structure. That's an institutionalist type of an approach. Second way we can define organization theory is that it's the structure of behaviors within the organization. So this is going to drill down to more of that micro level approach. So in this micro level approach, we're looking at the behaviors of the individuals who populate these organizations. This is very similar to in the 1960s and 70s, what was known as the behavioralist approach in political science. So instead of studying Congress as an organization, we studied individual members of Congress. And if you've taken the policy class, or if you've taken me for 500, you're probably familiar with the name John Kingdon. And you know, John Kingdon, who did a lot of work in the area of policy analysis, was also very enamored with Congress. And one of his major pieces of work was he wanted to look at trying to define the decision-making process of individual members of Congress and produce for his readers a flowchart that took up 2 pages of his book, where he would say, if a member of Congress is from this state, then they're likely to support this piece of legislation. And then we ask the question, is this person a member of one of these caucuses or a member of a conference? Then that could have an impact upon how they vote. And so it's basically a flow chart with all these arrows where you could follow all the arrows down to the bottom of the flow chart, and it would then predict how a member of Congress was going to behave, how they would vote on a piece of legislation. That is obviously a behavioralist type of an approach. And so we take a behavioralist approach as well in some of our theories that we're going to study this semester in organization theory. So that's another way in which we can study organizations. The third way we can study organizations is by studying the relationship between the organization and the members of that organization. The corollary to this in political science is what's known as the post-behavioralist era. And that post-behavioralist era, which obviously came after the behavioralist era, so we're talking about late 1970s into the 1980s, started asking the question of not the structure of the organization, not necessarily an individual's behavior, but this kind of symbiotic relationship between the individual and the organization. So to keep with our theme of studying Congress, you would be asking the question, how does the individual member of Congress relate to Congress as an institution? And then what influences does Congress as an institution have upon those individual members? And so what this would have suggested to you, if you were studying Congress, is that you would need to study the House of Representatives much differently than you would study the U.S. Senate. We know the House of Representatives is a much more structured, much more really entrenched in policies and procedures. Leaders in the House of Representatives have a lot more control over individual members. Individual members work very hard to curry favor with leaders in the House, whether it be the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader or the Minority Leader or whips, whatever the case may be. They curry favor and work toward that much more so than their colleagues in the Senate, which a much more equal representation, much more of a collegial and egalitarian type of situation. So we look at different ways in which members of the House relate to the House of Representatives as opposed to how senators relate to the U.S. Senate. But here in the public sector, we ask a similar type of question. How do our employees relate with our organization, and how does the organization relate to our employees? We are going to see this focus most prominently when we get into schools of thought such as human resource management and human relations. So when we talk about people like Chester Barnard and the whole idea of this transactional relationship between the leaders of the organization and individual employees, we're really taking on this focus of the relationship between the organization and its incumbent members. Then the fourth way is to look beyond the walls of the organization and ask the question, how does the organization influence its external environment? How does the external environment influence the organization? If you remember back to your PPA 500 course, this would be systems theory. And so we'll spend some time looking at organization theory from the perspective of a systems approach, looking beyond the walls of the organization. So those are just four different ways in which we can kind of define what we are trying to accomplish in developing these theories to understand our organizations. If you take those four approaches, you can kind of distill them down into three different ways to view organization theory. The first way is the macro level approach. So that's your institutional, structural type of orientation, where we focus at the organizational level. How's the organization organized? And then most important for us will be, what does this organization structure mean for the outputs and the outcomes of the organization? Again, as you probably know through your time in this program, there is a difference between organizational outputs and organizational outcomes. An output of an organization will be the goods and services, the products that are being created by that organization on a daily basis. So the output of a public works department will be those potholes being filled on the freeways. That is the daily output of that organization. Then hopefully that daily output will then lead to the types of consequences that we are hoping for. Those long-term consequences for our beneficiaries, those are our outcomes. So if we're filling the potholes, hopefully there'll be less damage to vehicles when they're driving on the freeways or driving on our streets if we're a public works department. Hopefully fewer accidents, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to look at what the structure of the organization then means for what the organization is creating on a daily basis, and then the long-term consequences of those outputs the organization is creating. So we see this macro level approach from classical theorists such as Max Weber. He's one of our most prominent ones that really focuses on this macro level approach. Secondly, we can view our organizations through a micro level approach. Again, this is looking at those individuals that we talked about on the previous slide within the organization. But we're not just looking at individual employees, not just people, but we can also look at the units, divisions, and the groups, both formal as well as informal groups that populate our organizations. So we're going beyond just the macro level organizational focus and actually getting into all the different aspects and all the different parts of this organizational machinery. This is, again, where we get into a lot of human relations and human resource management and some of the more modern and postmodern types of organization theories. Then our third view, way in which we can view organizations, is through the management approach. The management approach, we are looking at the specific processes and practices, the managerial practices within the organization. And so quality management, structural, functional type of management also kind of gets into some of these policies and some of these practices that go on within the organization. So you can study the organization itself. We can study the components of the organization. We can also study the management practices and policies and processes within the organization. So a lot of different ways in which we can study public and nonprofit organizations. Now, some of the discrete schools of thought that we are going to be covering in our time together, and I know it's a 6-week course, so we don't have a lot of time together, but we'll start with classic bureaucratic theory, and that is Max Weber. You probably already know about classic bureaucratic theory and Max Weber from 500, but we are going to get into it a little bit more in depth in this class. We're going to talk about where classic bureaucratic theory comes from, why Max Weber tends to focus on this macro level type of an approach, and Max Weber's real affinity for a bureaucratic, rational basis for power and authority. So that's going to be one of the first schools of thought that we will talk about. We'll also talk about the School of Scientific Management that you're also familiar with Frederick Taylor. But again, we will drill down a little bit more specifically into where scientific management came from and some of the advantages and disadvantages of scientific management and some of the aspects of scientific management that are still alive and well in modern organizations today. So that's Scientific Management School. We will talk about the School of Administrative Management and Principles with people like Henri Fayol, Mooney, Luther Gullig, and kind of talk about this whole idea of if we can develop universal principles and then apply those principles to all of our organizations, that universal set of principles can then be effective at guiding the behaviors of our organizations. And this is, again, very much that one size fits all approach. So that one size fits all approach is a strong undercurrent that ties together classic bureaucratic theory, the School of Scientific Management, and the School of Administrative Management and Principles. And that's kind of their thread that ties them all together. And that's going to be our primary focus here is as we go through all these different schools of thought, finding those threads that really connect the different schools over a century and a half of literature. Human relations theory, another school we'll look at. And here within human relations, we'll talk about human relations as well as human resource management. So we'll get people like Mary Parker Follett. If you have me for 500, you know, she's one of my favorite authors, but we'll really get into some details on Mary Parker Follett in democratic governance. Douglas McGregor, Abraham Maslow, Chris Argyris, Frederick Herzberg. Those are some of the major, what we would call neoclassical theorists that wrote their theories primarily as a response, a rejoinder to the classical theories of classic scientific management and administrative management. Systems theory. That's another school we'll talk about that you're already familiar with, but we'll talk more about what it means for the way in which we study our organizations to take that external environment into account. Structural functional theory, we'll talk about that as we talk about systems theory. We'll talk about Robert Merton and the way in which Robert Merton was kind of a nice segue between closed and open systems theory. We'll talk about more modern, and again, I use that term very, very loosely, but more modern schools, such as the School of Quality Management. We'll talk about the School of Organization Culture, and we'll finally talk about the School of Leadership. So with classic bureaucratic theory, we will start in the late 1800s. And then with organization culture and leadership, we will talk about contemporary approaches to studying public and nonprofit organizations. So those are the schools of thought that we will go through chronologically, again, looking for those threads that tie those schools together. But let's talk a bit about the rationale for why we have this 60 course here in the MPA program and why it is important to study public organizations differently than we study private organizations. And these are all points that, again, I know you are familiar with being in the MPA program. You've talked about these points in other classes. But clearly, public organizations are fundamentally different than the private sector in terms of their power and authority. So let's talk a little bit about the power and authority of public organizations and why that makes a difference in how we study those organizations. So give me a definition of power. So anyone wants to give me a definition of power? What is power?
Ability to
Control.
influence decisions. Oh, sorry, I thought it was supposed to talk. I'm sorry.
No, you can. Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. To influence decisions. I was just going to point out that Emma said in text, yeah, control a lot of money. Those are resources. But you're absolutely right. The ability to influence decisions and the ability to influence decisions oftentimes through the use of resources. So resources are oftentimes a prerequisite in order to be able to influence decisions. It is clear to us that public organizations certainly do exercise power. They have resources, they have money that comes by the way of public appropriations. Having those public appropriations also provide them with a lot of stability that private sector organizations do not have. These appropriations tend to be far more stable than money that comes into a private corporation through the profits that they are generating. So we have a lot of these resources, and we have these resources in terms of money, but we also have these resources in terms of legal authority. So my next question to you is, where do public organizations come from? How are public organizations created? And you can use your microphone, you can use text chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
They are created by the government in response to things that the private sector doesn't want to do.
Exactly. Yeah, as Emma said, they are created by government. They are created through this enabling legislation. And so Congress will pass enabling legislation that will then be signed by the president that then brings these organizations into existence. As Emma correctly notes, the justification, the reason why these public organizations are created is oftentimes for things like market failures. So the private sector is either incapable or unwilling to provide and produce a good or a service, then the responsibility falls to the creation of a public organization, and the public organization needs to then produce and provide. That provision and production of that good or that service or that commodity is done by the public sector, oftentimes because there is not a profit incentive for private sectors to provide it. And so, therefore, you have the failure of the market or a market failure. So, because they're being created by Congress, they have this legal authority provided to them through laws. And that provides them with more of a legal authority than you would have with a private corporation. So, if you've had me before, you know that my favorite question in every class is, so what? And my favorite answer is, it depends. Well, here is the question of so what? Well, so what? So public organizations have more power and more legal authority than private corporations. Well, so what? What does that mean for us as students of public organizations? How does that affect the way in which we would study a public organization? Any ideas on that one?
There's more study of ethics involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's more study of ethics and accountability. This public authority and these public resources are public in nature. And so what we are doing is we're managing taxpayer dollars. When you're managing taxpayer dollars, obviously you have this ethical upgrade in these public organizations as compared to private corporations that are managing private money. And so there's a lot more need and desire for accountability. And so, as we study these public organizations, we are going to see a lot more policies and procedures, a lot more ethical adherence, a lot more codes of conduct that our administrators are going to have to adhere to than we might see in the private sector. So, it kind of makes it a little bit more complicated for us in studying these public organizations. Also, these public organizations, when they are created in this enabling legislation, that enabling legislation will not just create the organization, but it will also then create essentially, won't maybe not necessarily say the mission, but kind of the heart of what the mission will be of the organization and the functions and responsibilities of that organization. So, if we are going to measure the effectiveness of a public organization and we're going to measure how well it's achieving its goals, those goals are oftentimes a little bit beyond the control of the organization in that they may come directly out of that legal authority, out of that enabling legislation. So sometimes it's a little bit more difficult for organizations to establish their own goals and then work toward achieving those goals. So if we're looking at effectiveness as how well we're achieving our goals, it's going to be a little bit different measuring it with the public as compared to a private organization. So power and authority means that we will need to study these organizations a bit differently. The oversight in terms of how well these organizations are doing, that oversight is fundamentally different between the two sectors as well. In the public sector, if you're looking at a federal agency, the primary oversight body for that federal agency is the Congress. And the Congress exercises oversight over how well the agency is doing its job. In a private corporation, that oversight is going to probably be coming from a board of directors. It'll be coming from the C-suite. It'll be coming from the consumers who are purchasing those goods and services. So the oversight's a little bit different between private and public sector organizations. External influences. By now in the program, you've probably talked ad nauseum about the different environment that the public sector operates within as compared to the private sector. As we know, in the public sector, we have all these influences, not just congressional oversight, but we also have a lot more media scrutiny. We also have a lot more of this direct interfacing with our citizens, especially if we're a public organization that's engaged in direct administration, as most of our local agencies are. You've got a very challenging and a lot of variation in the actors in the environment, as well as the vested interest in what those actors want to get out of organizations. If you've taken the 670 policy class, you've talked a lot about identifying stakeholders, primary and secondary and tertiary stakeholders. And when you do get to 697 and you're doing your policy analysis case study, one of the things you'll need to do in that case study is to identify the stakeholders. And sometimes you'll be required to identify multiple stakeholders. I think in the last case study that the last round of 697 students did, I believe they were identifying at least 15 different stakeholders, individuals and groups in the external environment that would have an influence on the policy and the operations of the organization. So you've got a lot more of these external influences. The big so what question here is obviously, well, what's the difference between public and private sectors in terms of their external environment and how we study them? The more varied, the more challenging, the more dynamic the external environment, the less likely it is that you will be able to identify one singular universal theory to apply to every public organization. We've got a lot of books out there on the private sector, on private sector management, and those books are going to tell us, well, here is the approach. Here is the way in which you run your corporation. That's a lot easier to do for a private corporation as compared to a public organization, given that external environment. And again, we'll talk a lot more about external environment and what it means for developing organization theories later on. And then this also contributes to my favorite answer to everything, which is it depends. Your appropriate theory that you apply to an organization will directly depend upon the environment in which that organization is operating. Third, the types of goals and objectives and the products and the goods and the services that we create are typically referred to as softer in the public as compared to the private sector. So if you want to measure the quality of the output of the organization, that's going to clearly be much easier to do with a private corporation that is creating widgets as compared to a public organization that is trying to enhance the quality of life of citizens in the community. So those softer goals and objectives makes it more difficult for us to define the effectiveness of the organization as, how well they created their output. So it makes it a lot more difficult for us to measure effectiveness. We have a lot of limitations on our actions as public managers. We again have these legal limitations that come to us from not only the enabling legislation, but also come to us from the concept of qualified good faith immunity, meaning that we need to understand the constitutional rights of people who we are dealing with and endeavor not to violate those constitutional rights. Legal in terms of civil service requirements, we need to adhere to those civil service requirements because the majority of our employees will be civil servants. Majority of our employees will probably also be unionized, which means we have to abide by the collective bargaining agreement. So we have a lot more of these legal constraints placed upon public organizations as compared to private organizations. So if we did the so what here is if we develop a theory that we are going to apply to all public organizations. Well, different organizations have different legal requirements that they have to adhere to. If you are a direct administration type of agency, and you are directly providing benefits of an entitlement program to your constituents, you've got a lot of legal requirements in terms of who gets those benefits, how they get those benefits, the due process of applying for and receiving those benefits. You're going to have a lot more of those types of legal requirements than if you're not involved in the direct administration of an eligibility-based program. So we've got all these additional legal types of requirements. We have all these additional procedure requirements, as we talked about, like Emma mentioned, for ethics and accountability. We have all these codes of ethics that we have to adhere to. We also have procedure requirements that come to us from our procedures manuals. Those procedure and policy manuals will flow directly from the purposes of the organization as expressed in the enabling legislation when the organization was created. You look no farther than just the hiring of new employees as a great illustration of the procedural challenges we encounter in a public organization as compared to in a private corporation. It takes us maybe 3, 6, 9 months to hire a public employee because we have a lot of these procedures we have to follow for a variety of different reasons that perhaps do not have to be followed in a private corporation. And then obviously politics. As you know from your 500 class, there is truly today no major distinction, no politics administration dichotomy, no major distinction or line between politics and administration in the work of public administrators. Public administrators are involved on the political side, politicians get involved on the administrative side. That bleeding over of politics and administration is there because of the inherent political nature of the policy process. And so, because of the political environment in which we operate, we have certain limitations that we are imposed upon us you may not have in the private sector. And it seems like with every passing year, those political types of influences are becoming more and more tangible and more pronounced than they've ever been in the past. So, since our public organizations kind of have these differences, it's important that we develop a separate set of public organization theories as opposed to just relying upon private organization theory. And because of all these differences, those organization theories and models that are developed for the private sector may not work equally well in a public organization. Our goals and objectives are certainly different, which will lead to these private sector theories not working as well. Our goals are usually a bit more societal in terms of their scope. So we have a much larger scope to our goals and our objectives. We're serving a more varied beneficiary base, more primary and secondary and tertiary beneficiaries. And so since our goals are much different than private sector goals, our theories have to be different as well. We oftentimes struggle with this principal-agent relationship. And if you've covered this before in 500, anyone remember what the principal-agent relationship is and why the principal-agent relationship is problematic in the public sector? Anybody remember that? Well, clearly in a principal-agent relationship, we have two parties here. We have a principal and we have an agent. The principal is the party, and I say party just, an individual or an institution, not a political party necessarily, but an individual or an institution that has oversight abilities and oversight responsibilities over the agent. So the principal oversees the agent. As we had mentioned, Congress oversees federal agencies. So Congress is the principal, the federal agencies are the agents. That's problematic because it's usually the agency that has more information than Congress. So whenever Congress oversees these agencies, it is incumbent upon these agencies to provide the information to Congress that Congress needs to properly oversee the agency's operations. There is a disincentive, obviously, for these agencies to provide all that information to Congress. Because the more information you provide to the overseer, the more information the overseer then has to then conduct oversight over your activities. So, because of that disincentive, as we talked about in the principal agent relationship, it creates this thing called a moral hazard for the administrator. So when you're testifying before Congress, you've got this moral hazard in that you know you should provide this information to Congress, but you know if you do, it's going to make your life a lot more difficult. That's called the moral hazard because you're in kind of this moral type of situation of deciding how much information to provide to Congress. That moral hazard exists because we've got this information asymmetry, this imbalance of information between principals and agents. So when we develop theories to study public organizations, we have to recognize that as a theorist, as someone who's studying the organization, we don't have access to the same information that the agency has. The agency is implementing this program or this policy on a daily basis. They're the ones who have all of the information about what they're doing daily and how this program is being implemented. We don't have that information. There are serious information asymmetries. So it's difficult for us as we are developing these theories to have all the information we need in order to develop the theory that will make the organization as effective as possible. That's why we sometimes see theorists that will embed themselves, at least for a temporary period of time, within the organization so they can at least have proximity to the policies, the practices, the procedures that are going on a daily basis within that organization. But this principal agent relationship really does make it kind of difficult for us to develop these theories, especially to develop a unifying theory that will apply to every public organization. We've already mentioned that it's very difficult for us to quantify the outputs and the outcomes that are being created by our public organizations. You can quantify widgets relatively well and measure their quality. You can't do that quite as well for enhancing quality of life. And then we also have problems in the public sector with performance measurement and the assignment of rewards for performance, pay for performance. Performance measurement is always difficult when you have unclear outputs, outcomes, and goals. And so just naturally, performance measurement is more difficult in the public sector. It also becomes more difficult with the existence of collective bargaining agreements. CBAs will almost always have an article in the collective bargaining agreement that governs how employee performance will be measured and then the consequences associated with those performance evaluations. So we always have to abide by that collective bargaining agreement, and oftentimes there'll be limitations on how often we can evaluate an employee, the type of form that we use to evaluate the employee, the process we use in terms of how much involvement the employee has in that performance evaluation process. And then also, public employee unions are oftentimes very hesitant to allow pay for performance programs to be incorporated within their collective bargaining agreements. There's always this concern among public employee unions of this slippery slope in that if we start going down the road toward pay for performance, the question then emerges, where does it end? And is it always going to be positive for our employees, or can there be negative types of results because of pay for performance? And how widespread will pay for performance become? And if pay for performance becomes very widespread, will it then erode our typical position classification and remuneration system that we have in the public sector? It's a really interesting topic. It's one that's explored at length by an author by the name of Ed Kellogg. And if you're really interested in pay for performance programs, I would direct you to his work, and I'll put his name in text chat. He's done a lot of great work in pay for performance, and how well pay for performance has worked in certain agencies. They have certainly tried to attempt it. Pay for performance is something that is very common in private organizations, and a lot of these private organization theories are very much predicated on pay for performance. and that pay is the reward for good performance. A lot of those theories, if they're based upon pay for performance, just don't have the applicability in a public organization. So I think what we've kind of done here, hopefully so far, is provided a justification for why we have felt a need to develop organization theories to apply specifically to public organizations, and why we cannot just borrow a private sector theory and apply it without any modifications into the public sector. But even if we are going to remain within the public sector and keep our focus in the public sector, we also need to acknowledge that panaceas, these one-size-fits-all approaches, just simply do not work. Even if you are trying to take a theory from one public organization and apply it to another public organization. Because we know even within public organizations themselves, we have a lot of differences between organizations. We know organizations can vary in terms of their size. One of the smallest organizations at the federal level is the Marine Mammals Conservation Commission. I believe that's the name of it. It is literally a commission made up of 12 or 13 marine biologists. So these are 12 or 13 people with PhDs in marine biology. That's kind of your commission. So it's a very, very small commission. Contrast that to departments like the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, which is a mammoth department. So if you've got a huge department like Department of Health and Human Services, the theory that works there may not work equally well in the Marine Mammal Conservation Commission and vice versa. So these varying sizes means that one size cannot fit all in terms of organization theories. As we know, we have different structures. We have some organizations that exhibit a very tall hierarchy, other organizations have a much flatter type of hierarchy. You look at a regulatory commission. Regulatory commissions tend to have flatter hierarchies. They are led by 5 or 7 or 9 commissioners. At the federal level, those commissioners are typically appointed by the president, oftentimes confirmed by the U.S. Senate, but they all have equal power as commissioners. You think about a board of supervisors, like we have here in Los Angeles County. So you have these 5 supervisors. They all, in theory, have equal amounts of power. It's a flatter type of hierarchical structure, at least at the very top of the organization. Then you can contrast that with an executive level department that has a secretary at the top, a series of several deputy secretaries below that, and then as you move down, it becomes much more of that tall type of hierarchy. So what works for an egalitarian flat hierarchy is probably not going to work equally well for a tall hierarchy, even though they are both public organizations. Differing functions. Different public organizations have different functions. As we had mentioned, some organizations tend to be involved in direct administration where they are directly interfacing with citizens in providing these oftentimes eligibility-based, entitlement-based programs, but they are working on a daily basis individually with citizens. Then you have more indirect administration. And those will be the organizations that provide the resources to then make direct administration possible by another organization. And these differing functions really do also underlie for us another major difference that's not on the screen there, but different levels of government. So if you're a direct administration agency at the local level, and then you have an indirect administration agency at the state level that's providing the funding and the resources for that local agency to do its job, obviously you're going to have different approaches you're going to have to take to understanding those different organizations. The indirect administration type of agency doesn't have any interaction necessarily with individual citizens. So they don't feel the same external pressures that the local agency will have with their direct dealings with people on a daily basis. Clearly, different environments will lead to different types of theories working. Some organizations get to exist in a very stable and very supportive type of an environment. Some organizations are in a very dynamic and not very supportive type of environment. Think about Department of Education is a good example of this. Look at the Department of Education today and compare the Department of Education to the environment it had 3 years ago. 3 years ago, it had a relatively stable and relatively supportive external environment. It was receiving appropriations as it expected to receive those appropriations. Its existence was not being drawn into question. Today, the Department of Education is being, and many will say almost completely, has been dismantled. You've seen a major downsizing in the workforce. You've seen a lot of the programs that the Department of Education used to be responsible for have now been moved out of education's portfolio and are now being moved to other agencies and other departments across the federal government. It's an understatement to say that today the Department of Education is operating in a very, very challenging type of environment, much different than it was 3 years ago. And again, no value judgments on it. It's just the environments have changed greatly over the course of about 3 years. So we have to understand the environment to understand how to study that organization. Also, different environments, even if they want to support the organization, may not have the resources available to do it. So organizations rely upon their external environments for a lot of different resources. Your staffing will come from your external environment. Your resources in terms of money will come from your external environment. Political support will come from your external environment. Even if you have an environment that would like to support the agency, it may not have the requisite skill set among its population to provide the organization with the employees the organization needs to be successful. It may not have the monetary resources, the fiscal resources to, should say fiscal, I guess, the fiscal resources to provide to the organization to help the organization do what it needs to do. Differing employees. We know that different organizations in the public sector have different types of employees. In our distance learning program, one of the work sites that we used to work with very frequently was Orange County Transit Authority, OCTA. OCTA is populated with engineers, and in that cohort, almost the entire cohort was made up of engineers. Engineers who were coming back to get their MPA because they had been promoted to management level positions, and so they wanted to gain those management skills that they had not gained undergraduate in their engineering programs. So OCTA has a lot of engineers. Those engineers tend to be obviously very intelligent, but they also tend to be very process focused. You have other organizations. You take DPSS, for example. You have many more people working there who are in the field of human services. And so they have a different orientation, and their orientation tends to be more in terms of interpersonal relationships with the clients that they are serving. So differing employees mean that those employees need to be managed differently. Also, in terms of differing employees, in some organizations, we have employees who have been there a very long time. And in other organizations, we have relatively new employees that populate most of the organization. Those two organizations are also going to have to be managed much differently from each other. If you have an organization where you have very veteran employees who have been in the organization for a long time, they have a lot of institutional memory, which is obviously a good thing. The downside of institutional memory is sometimes they don't want to go against the status quo. To know how many times in an organization you hear people say, well, why are you doing it this way? And we're doing this way because we've always done it this way. Well, that's not really a great answer, but that's the answer that they will give because they really become entrenched with the way in which the organization has always operated. Oftentimes, when you have an organization populated with those veteran employees, you will have an organization that is filled with what Anthony Downs refers to as conservers. And so those are going to be your conservers within your organization. According to Anthony Downs, conservers are employees who want to kind of keep the perks of the office that they have already acquired. So these are the folks who have been there for a while. They have moved up the organization chart. They're in management level positions. Maybe they have the nice corner office. Maybe they have the really nice close parking space. These are all they have, benefits that they have acquired over the years. They want to try and conserve all these perks of the office, and that's their primary motivation. So you would certainly manage a conserver much different than you would manage a younger employee who Tony Downs or Anthony Downs refers to as a climber. He says younger, more recently hired employees tend to be these climbers. They are motivated not by trying to conserve the perks of the office that they've already acquired, but they are obviously motivated by the ability to move up in the organization. They want promotions, and so promotions will be what will motivate those employees. So again, and we can go on and on all night about this. Managing generations is a big piece of the organization theory literature recently. How do we manage all these different generations that we currently have in our organization? Do you manage a baby boomer the same way you manage a Gen Xer, or the same way you manage a millennial, or a Gen Z, or whatever all the I guess it's Gen Beta, I guess is the newest generation out there, or obviously way too young to be in organizations now. But how do you manage all these different generations? And the way in which you manage a millennial may very well be different than how you manage a Gen Xer. So differing employees mean that you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. And then differing technologies in providing and producing their goods and services. Different organizations will utilize different types of technologies. Now, if you haven't been introduced to it yet, there is what I like alliteration, and so I like to call it Thompson's typology of technology. And Thompson's typology of technology essentially creates for us three different types of technologies that tend to be used in public organizations. The first type of technology that tends to be used is what's called a log-linked technology. And in a log-linked technology, think an assembly line. So in an assembly line, each person's job is based upon the job of the person that comes before them on the assembly line. So in a auto factory on the assembly line, as the car moves down the assembly line, one person will put the headlights on. Next person might put the bumper on. The next person might put the grill on, and so on and so on. It's called a log link type of technology because they're kind of like those logs that are linked together. And they all are based upon the log that comes before them. So that is the simplest type of technology, log link technology. We see some of this in public organizations. You think about something like processing paperwork. So sometimes before the paperwork arrives at your desk, it has to go through someone else's desk first, and they process part of that application. Then the application comes to you, and you process your part of the application. Then it goes to someone else, and so on and so on. That is what's called a log-linked technology. But again, it's a lot more common in assembly line types of factory settings. Then the second type of technology is what's called a mediating technology. In a mediating technology, the job of the administrator is to connect the client, the citizen, the constituent with resources. So, again, think about like an employment bureau. And so the goal of that employment bureau is to help people find gainful employment. So someone will reach out to the employment bureau. The employment bureau will then, based upon the qualifications of that individual, provide them with maybe job leads, may provide them with different types of training programs so they can acquire the skills they need to get the job they want. They are kind of serving as this mediating factor between the services and the individual citizen. So that's what's called a mediating type of technology. A lot of interfacing with individuals in order to provide them with the resources that they need. And we see a lot of that obviously happening in a lot of our public agencies, especially at the local level of government. Then the third type of technology is what's called an intensive technology. In intensive technology, this is where administrators are working with individuals on a daily basis and will tailor the way in which they work with the person based upon the characteristics of the situation, what that person needs, the current context of why they are approaching the organization. In intensive technology, you have to make a lot of decisions on the fly when you are dealing with individuals, and you may deal with one individual in one way and another individual in another way based upon their different types of needs. So, an intensive technology is something that is much more sophisticated as compared to a log linked type of technology. So, if you're looking like something like scientific management and you're focusing really on efficiency, that's going to work well in a log link type of technology, but it's going to probably be a colossal failure in an intensive type of technology. There is no one best way to do the job in an intensive technology, where there may be a one best way to do the job in a log linked technology. So, not to belabor this too much, but just to illustrate that even working within the public sector itself, there are no panaceas. It's not possible to take what we have learned in one organization and then apply it to every other public organization across the board. What we have learned in our study of 150 years of organization theory is that understanding organizations is contextual in nature. There are no panaceas. There is no magic bullet, no one best way to organize or structure or run public organizations. That obviously makes our work a little bit more complicated and a little bit messier than it otherwise would be. And we'll see that as we go through the chronological development of the organization theory literature. The early theories from Weber and Taylor and our administrative management and principles theorists, those types of theories tend to be relatively simplistic and focused on the one-size-fits-all approach. Our more modern theories tend to be a lot more complex and a lot more difficult to understand and to implement. So, speaking of this chronological development, last week at the end of our class, I very quickly kind of foreshadowed for you the three ways in which we will compare all these different organization theories to each other over our 6 weeks together. What I'd like to do now is just kind of revisit that very quickly to put a little bit more flesh on the bones, if you will, and to give you a little bit more detail in terms of these three different ways to understand the development of public organization theories. Now, as we talked about at the end of class last week, the first way in which we will do it is by identifying which model of organizational effectiveness the theory relies upon. And so I presented to you last week, and hopefully you have access to the digital version of the textbook. I believe the page numbers are the same in the digital and the print version. Hopefully they are. But in the print version on page 28 in Exhibit 3.1, as I told you last week, this is where Tompkins introduces us to the four models of organizational effectiveness. But let me talk a little bit more in depth tonight about how he arranges those in his matrix, those four different models. So in this matrix, I think as we mentioned quickly last week, there are two axes. There is a y-axis and there is an x-axis. On the y-axis, you have the axis of flexibility to control. So all those models that are at the top of the axis, at the top of the matrix, will favor flexibility, allowing the employees to make decisions, allowing the employees to participate, understanding that there are different situations and different contexts that we have to take into account as we develop our theories of making our organizations effective. The ones that are located at the bottom of the chart are more oriented around control. This is your more classical top-down. We can be effective as an organization if we can control employee behavior, if we can control the policies, the processes, and the regulations within the organization itself. So array them based upon flexibility versus control. And then on the x-axis, we array them based upon an internal focus on the left or an external focus on the right. So do our theories look within the organization, the operations inside the organization, or do our theories look beyond the walls of the organization in a much more external type of way? I think that creates for you these four different cells in the matrix and does a really good job of allowing us to contrast these different types of models of organizational effectiveness. Now, again, the way in which we are doing this is we are asking the question, what is the goal of the theory? What is the theory trying to accomplish? And in almost all of these situations, the goal of the theory is to make our organization more effective. After all, that is kind of the end goal of the MPA program, that you can leave the MPA program equipped with the theories and the concepts and the skills necessary to help make public and nonprofit organizations as effective as possible. How that effectiveness is measured will depend upon which of these models of organizational effectiveness are being used. So again, we started with we'll start with the human relations in the top left-hand cell in our matrix. This one is at the top of the cell, focuses on flexibility. On the left of the matrix, so it is focusing on an internal type of focus. So we're looking within the organization, but we are favoring flexibility, allowing individual employees more latitude to participate in their decision making. Clearly, that model is known as a human relations model. So in this human relations model, through developing a cohesive workforce that has high morale, that will then help you accomplish the goal of helping people develop as human resources. You also see that at the top of the cell for human relations, he refers to this pattern maintenance tension management function that focuses on the need to maintain a competent, integrated, and dedicated workforce. So here we are focusing on individuals who are working within the organization. If we can create this competent, this dedicated, this motivated type of workforce, we can help those employees develop as human resources. That will not only help the organization be more effective, but it also obviously beneficial to our individual employees as well. So some of our theories will look at a human relations model of organizational effectiveness. Below that is the internal process model of organizational effectiveness. The internal process model, being at the bottom, focuses on control, being on the left, focuses on an internal focus. Here we are trying to manage our information, manage our communication in order to create stable, well-controlled work processes within our organization. So the function here is the integrative function, the need to coordinate and control work activities. So we measure effectiveness with this model by how well controlled and how well coordinated all the processes are within our organization. And that will be our ultimate measure of effectiveness. So you can see that a theory you develop to try and further a human relations model of effectiveness may be much different than what you would develop for an internal process model. Just having controlled processes does not necessarily lead to competent, cohesive workforce and motivated employees, as we'd be looking for in the human relations type of model. Top right, we have the open systems model. Top of the chart favoring flexibility. To the right of the chart favoring external focus. Here, the function is the adaptive function. The need to acquire resources and adapt to an uncertain environment. The way in which we do that is through maintaining readiness and flexibility, and that readiness and flexibility will then lead to growth and resource acquisition. So we measure effectiveness in the open systems model by how well the organization has acquired necessary resources from its external environment. Subsumed within this goal of trying to acquire necessary resources is naturally agency growth and survival. If you're going to grow and survive as an organization, you are going to need to acquire these necessary resources from your external environment. So clearly, you have to remain flexible. Top of the chart, you have to have an external focus on the right side. So here we're really focusing on and emphasizing the importance of how the environment affects the organization and how the organization can affect the environment. Very much systems theory. Then in the bottom right, our final model of organizational effectiveness is the rational goal model. Here, the goal attainment function is the need to focus on efforts for goal attainment. So here, our measure of effectiveness is how well we have achieved the goals that we have or someone else has established for our organization. We do that obviously through strategic planning, through goal setting, and by achieving these goals, we hopefully will be more productive and more efficient as an organization as well. So again, the theory that you develop for a rational goal model is going to focus on those goals that you are trying to achieve, which may be different than merely agency survival as it would be up in the open systems approach, or helping develop your employees as human resources as it would be in the human relations approach, and so on and so on. The important thing that I really want to emphasize for you is that these four models of organizational effectiveness are by no means mutually exclusive. We will see some of our theories that will highlight one, two, three, sometimes all four of these models of organizational effectiveness. We will also look at some schools of thought and some theories that do not emphasize any of these four models of effectiveness. So an example of that could be the structural contingency type of school. Structural contingency is all based on it depends. It depends upon the situation. So in some situations, you're focusing on survival, some you're focusing on developing your employees, and so on and so on. So there's really no one that is really emphasized. The other thing I'll point out to you with the use of Exhibit 3.1 is one of the flaws in Tompkins' approach is that what he will do is he will shade in which of those models is being utilized in a certain school of thought or a certain theory. However, there are situations where you may have a theory that emphasizes two of these, but emphasizes one more than the other. So what I would like to come through a little bit more clearly, and maybe it's just a reprinting type of issue, but that some of the cells would be grayed in a little bit more darker than others. And so the ones that are really the emphasis would be grayed in much more than those that are not the emphasis. But as we go through here, we will talk, as we go through each of our schools of thought and theories, we will talk about how they relate to these models of organizational effectiveness. And I will be very open to you when I disagree with Tompkins' analysis. I will tell you that. Feel free as you go through this to disagree with Tompkins as well. Feel free to disagree with me as well, because I think that it's all about your interpretation as you go through and study all these schools of thought. Just because someone authored a textbook and just because someone teaches a class does not necessarily mean that they are always quote unquote correct in their interpretations. So feel free to develop your own interpretations as you look at these different schools of thought. Then the second dimension we are going to look at, as we talked about last week, are these mechanisms for coordination control by Mintzberg. So what Mintzberg does for us is he presents to us 6 different mechanisms that these theories may use to coordinate and control work within organizations. So the first one is mutual adjustment. This is one that we see most oftentimes in neoclassical theories such as human relations and human resource management. Workers consult with each other informally about what needs to be accomplished and how. Responsibility for coordination and control rests with those who do the work. So we are locating decision-making in proximity to those who are actually doing the work on a daily basis. This is an important part of a lot of organization theories, the proximity of decision-making power to information. And so we also, in this one, favor people working in groups, and we want them to work together and collaborate to participate in making decisions. The second mechanism we can use to control and coordinate work is obviously direct supervision. That's just what it sounds like. A supervisor is assigned to take responsibility for a group of workers, and a managerial hierarchy is established, so on and so on. Very much that classical top-down type of an approach. Third, standardization of work processes. Here is really relies upon training. This is kind of that scientific management. We teach people how to do jobs. We standardize the way in which jobs are done. By standardizing work processes, we can guarantee that people have a standard process to follow. Hopefully, a standardized process will then result in a standardized output. Speaking of outputs, standardization of work outputs, making sure that the outputs, the products and the goods and the services that are being created on a daily basis are standardized, that they are all of equal and equivalent quality. And again, certainly the process hopefully will lead to the output. That's what quality management theorists told us. Standardization of worker skills, making sure that all of our employees have the requisite skill set in order to do the job effectively and efficiently. Yet another important part of Frederick Taylor in scientific management. And then finally, standardization of values. We can coordinate and control work by making sure that people share similar values and standardize those values across the entire organization. Organizational leaders communicate and act upon a clear vision of what the organization, clear vision of what the organization exists to do, where it should be headed, and what values should guide it. So if we can standardize these values and make sure that everyone shares these values across the organization, that's a way in which we can control the work that occurs on a daily basis. So the mechanisms for coordination control look at the daily work that goes on within the organization. And then, as we said at the end of class last week, the third factor that we will look at as we compare all these different theories is how do they say to motivate our employees? What motivational strategies do they emphasize? And there are four of those. The first one is legal compliance. So using those rules and those formal directives and sanctions to direct and control employee behavior. So employees all have to come to work. They all have to be punctual. They have to work within their roles. And if not, then there are punitive consequences that will be applied for violating those rules and regulations. So you hold people accountable through legal compliance. Secondly, you have instrumental rewards, and these can take the form of several different things. An instrumental reward could be a reward for performance, distributing pay, promotion, recognition based on individual performance. Employees may meet or exceed role expectations because they value the material and the psychological satisfaction that money, advancement, and recognition can provide. I'm going without my glasses tonight, and I'm seeing that it was a mistake, but I'm trying. So those rewards for performance. Again, we're very limited in that in the public sector, we rely primarily on recognition as opposed to actual remuneration. But those are those rewards for performance, very instrumental rewards. Considerate leadership. Considerate leadership is essentially paying attention to our employees, adopting a leadership style that's based on being attentive to employees and considerate of their needs. As we get to later on in the class, later on in our semester, we'll talk about leadership school. And in the leadership school, I introduce you to different types of leadership approaches. One of them is what's known as the human relations approach, that's sometimes pejoratively referred to as country club leadership. That's where the leader will place a higher value on building rapport with employees as opposed to necessarily being productive and getting the job done. But considerate leadership is paying attention to those employees. By paying attention to employees, obviously you are motivating them. And then third is group acceptance, understanding that groups exist within organizations and allowing people to work within these groups. As Elton Mayo tells us, organizations are social in nature, so therefore we have to understand that groups will exist and fostering those groups can motivate employees. Sometimes people are going to be more productive working in a group than working as a singular employee. Job identification. The more people relate to the work that they are doing, the more likely they are going to be motivated to be productive and to do a good job. This type of theory would require that we involve our employees in position descriptions and designing their own jobs so they can design the types of tasks that can help them develop as human resources. And then finally, goal agreement or goal congruence. We can motivate employees by making sure that our organizational goals are congruent with and aligned with the goals of individual employees. The more that organization goals come into congruence with individual goals, obviously, the more likely people will be motivated toward working to achieve those stated goals. So those are the three factors, as we said last week, that we will be using as we talk about each one of our schools of thought and the theories within each of those schools of thought to try and draw similarities and differences between what those theories are telling us about how we either structure or manage our organizations and our employees. So I just wanted to cover that tonight, which is a little bit more in-depth fashion compared to what we did last week, because it will be a major staple of this class. Because every week in every theory, we are going to go back and revisit what this theory means for organizational effectiveness, what it means for how we control and coordinate work, and what it means for how we motivate our employees. So those are kind of the foundational basic elements to kind of get us going and understanding why we study public organizations, how public organizations differ from private organizations, and how we have to develop different theories to try and understand those differences. So what I thought we would do then in the second part of class tonight is like we're going to try and do every week is to use our breakout groups. And so we'll break up into breakout rooms. Since we'll probably have about 13 or 14 folks participating in our breakout rooms. What I'll probably do is I'll probably create 3 rooms, and then I'll just randomly assign you to rooms, and we'll do random assignment every week so you have a chance to work with different folks every single class. For these breakout rooms, what we will do is the assignment asks that each group should discuss their organizations and then identify 2 characteristics that are common to your organizations that would make it difficult to apply private organization theories to study those organizations. So what I'm hoping you do is I hope we have people working in different organizations, but kind of come to an agreement as a group on 2 characteristics that are shared by all your organizations that would make it difficult to apply private organization theories to your organization. And then what each group will also do is to select a spokesperson, because what we'll do is we'll spend about half an hour or so working in these groups to come up with these answers. We'll then reconvene as a class, and then we'll share out what each group came up with. At that point in time, we'll then reassess our time, see how much time we have left, and whether or not it makes sense to go into discussion of classic theory. But we'll jump off that bridge when we get to it at the end of class tonight. But before we do these breakout groups, let's go ahead and take a break like we normally do. So if you can take about a 10-minute break, come on back then at, we'll just say 7:35 to round it off for you. Come on back at 7:35. I will create these breakout rooms. We'll get in the breakout room, spend about half an hour working on the exercise. So go ahead and take a break. Come on back at 7:35. Okay, welcome back. It is 7:35. So, but before we do our breakout rooms, let me just ask, I know we covered all that information in the first half of class. Are there any questions or any clarifications needed on any of that information up to this point? All good? Okay. All right, then let me go ahead and create our breakout rooms. Given the number we have, maybe we'll just do 2 rooms. I think that probably would work better. So I'll create 2 rooms. Let me just assign everyone automatically. So Okay, so I've created two rooms. I think we have right now five in each room, and then as people come in, I'll toss them into rooms. But again, what we're doing is this exercise there on the screen, and then if each group could come up with a spokesperson, we'll do this for about half an hour. So we'll say maybe about a little bit after 8, 8:05, 8:10. Reconvene as a class, see what each group came up with. What I will also do is I'll give you time updates in case you lose track of time. And so when we have 5 minutes left, I'll alert you to that. When we get down to 2 minutes, I'll alert you to that. And then whenever I do close the rooms, you'll then have 1 minute to then return into the main classroom. But again, I think about half an hour probably would be enough to suffice. So let me open up the rooms and then you can go to your assigned room. Okay, rooms are open, so you can have at it. And I'll talk to you again in about half an hour. Okay, looks like we are all back. So let's go ahead and see what each room came up with. So let's start with our first room, and that's AJ, Ashley, Diana, Karen, Michael, and Mohammed.
Yes, they have asked me to speak for group one. And we had a lot of great input because we have folks who represent nonprofits and different size public institutions and governmental support institutions. And then a couple folks who are selecting organizations that they don't belong to, but brought that perspective. So, what we uh, two of uh, the issues that we initially talked about was regulations and scrutiny around regulations and funding for public institutions and nonprofits. Funding is limited and it needs to be planned well in advance, whereas private institutions can spend money to, modify the results. And speaking of results, it often is very tough to measure in public and nonprofit organizations because changing lives takes years. Whereas in industry or private institutions, you can measure what was produced or the amount of money that was made. And, some of the regulations around, like Ashley is in admissions, there are strict guidelines. In 2.0, that's it. You can't make exceptions. Um, and then one interesting observation that Karen made was the politicians are telling state employees what they can and cannot do, like coming back in the office 5 days. And then it needed to be bargained in some cases. And some agencies were not really state agencies, but the optics said that they needed to be in the office. So they chose 2 or 3 in order to adhere to that. But those, external constraints we have with stakeholders, anything that we want to communicate needs to go through many, many layers of approvals. And, like I said, we're very difficult to measure outcomes. So I don't know if I summarized that or if I just listed it off, but those are some of the things we talked about.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, that was great. And they're all those are all appropriate. The one I really want to pick up on that I like a lot is the idea of planning far in advance in the public sector. That is a common theme for all public organizations. As you correctly mentioned, your group brings up in terms of appropriations, in terms of the money that we receive. Since that money comes in through appropriations, oftentimes those are 12-month appropriations. And so those are appropriations that are done, once per year. In some states that use biennial budgeting, it's every 2 years. And so you do have to plan that spending very far in advance. And you have very strict limitations in terms of how you spend that money. If you want to spend money that's in one line item in another line item, there are some accounting things you can do, like object reclassification and things such as that. But there are procedures that you have to follow in order to remain in accordance with GASB regulations. And so you're right. I mean, we have to plan those well in advance. And it's not just the money we plan well in advance. We also plan strategic planning usually is much more in advance than private sector. And strategic planning, we oftentimes put together plans for 5 and 7 years in the future, which tends to be a much more protracted process as compared to what we see in the private sector. And the regulations are always going to be there in the public sector. And so, yeah, if you can act much quicker in a private corporation, you can have a theory or a model that requires quick action that you can implement appropriately in the private sector. And we typically oftentimes cannot do that in our public organizations. So I think those are all great points and great illustrations of those differences and why private theories may not work as well in our public organizations. So it's perfect. Thank you, AJ. I appreciate that. Very well done.
Thank you.
We'll move on to room number 2.
All right. So, in our conversation, we all kind of had similar characteristics in that our jobs in our public sector are limited by a rigid pay scale. And so, unlike the private sector that can incentivize more pay or bonuses, that's not necessarily the case where the five of us work. And a lot of our decisions, almost all of our decisions, are led by policies or rules set by our organization. And so we can't really do what our client or customer would like us to do. We're, limited by the scope of the policies set out by our organization. And then I think too, looking at the difference in goals and objectives that the private sector has compared to public sector. Within the public sector, we kind of have to build more of a rapport, or at least show to an extent that we care about our customers and clients, which isn't always the case in a private setting. And so we do have to prioritize the person over perhaps meeting a very specific goal that has a number attached to it. So that summarizes what we all had in common.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Emily. Well
You're
done.
welcome.
Well said. And the one that I'll pick up on is the very first thing you said about the stepping column and
Mhm.
how we have these pay scales, we have these pay grades. And so we are very limited in our ability to use compensation or any type of pay for performance. And I know in my district when I was on the board, one of the strategies we use would be a MOU. And we
Mhm.
would write a memorandum of understanding with the union if we had, for example, during COVID, we had some employees who were actually working outside their description, and so we had to give them additional compensation for that. But because we were going to do that on a temporary basis, we did it with the MOU rather than going through the collective bargaining agreement and putting that into the CBA. But what
Mhm.
we had to do is we had to do a meet and confer with the union and work out that MOU because it was on a temporary basis. But also we had to have that MOU because it was not in the step and column system. So to provide that extra stipend, that extra pay, it had to be done through a temporary MOU. And so that's kind of a common way that a lot of agencies kind of try and work their way around the traditional step and column system. But it is very limiting in our ability to provide any type of pay for performance. And that's certainly one of the major differences. And as we'll see as we go through the next several weeks, a lot of those theories that come out of the world of business, they are very much predicated upon pay for performance. And so if it's a theory that's predicated on pay for performance, for the most part, it's going to be a non-starter in a lot of our public agencies. So thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, group number 2. Very well done. I think those are all great points and great ways to illustrate why we need to develop our own unique theories to understand our public organizations. I do see it's 8:20, and so I don't think we really have time to move into classical organization theory. So we'll hold that in abeyance until next week. We get together next week, we'll devote our entire session to classic organization theory. Same type of approach. We'll present the information the first half of class, take a break, and then have an exercise we do in our breakout rooms in the second half of class. Again, if you haven't submitted a Canvas essay number 1 yet, please do that by tonight. I'll get those turned around and feedback to you as soon as possible. But again, all the organizations look great. I think they'll work perfectly for our organizational analysis assignments. Okay. I'll get this recording up on our Canvas site sometime tomorrow afternoon. What I'm using now is I'm using the Beach captioning service, and so sometimes it takes them a little bit longer than if I did it through YouTube, but at least the captions are accurate through Beach captioning. So it may be sometime late tomorrow afternoon, early evening that the recording will be up there for you. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Great seeing you again. And believe it or not, next week we'll be at our halfway point of our semester together. It's amazing how quickly summer sessions go, but certainly plenty of time to get through all of our information without a problem. So have a great evening. Have a great remainder of your week. And I will talk to you then again next Tuesday. Take
Thank
care.
you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.